Welcome to Bloody Violent History. My name is Tom Assheton, and this is the first in a three-part series on the IED. IED is the acronym for Improvised Explosive Device. It is rather an innocuous term for something so vicious, haphazard and deadly as a bomb, a homemade bomb. And perhaps that's part of the problem. Homemade sounds all too amateur and trifling. So in the next few episodes, I will be discussing the IED with a soldier who has fought in Iraq and Afghanistan, a surgeon who has operated on the men and women from our armed forces who've been wounded and killed by IEDs, and an expert on IEDs with knowledge of their form, deployment and legacy. IEDs were responsible for 2/3 of the UK Armed Forces casualties in both the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. Part 1. The Infantry Soldier. My guest today was born in England and grew up in Wiltshire. He came from a military family and in 2006, aged 23, he joined the British Army, serving in the Rifles, a distinguished infantry regiment formed in the time of the Napoleonic Wars and popularised in Sharp's Rifles books and TV series by Bernard Cornwell. He saw active duty in both Iraq 2007 and Afghanistan in 2009. He left the army in 2014 and lives with his wife and children in London. He is an artist and writer. He is also the creative director of the Chelsea History Festival, which is held every year in the last week of September in London. His first novel, Anatomy of a Soldier, was published in 2016 to great acclaim. Alan Bennett stated it was marvellously told and engrossing. I know of nothing quite like it. And Hilary Mantel praised it as tense and unflinching, but alive to every nuance of feeling. His latest book, Hybrid Humans, Dispatches from the Frontiers of Man and Machine, published in February 2022. Harry Parker, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me on, Tom.
Well, we've been meaning to do this for a little while because we have a mutual friend called James Jackson, who is my co-pilot on this particular podcast, but he's not here today.
At least we'll be able to get a word in edgeways then.
I know, exactly. Okay, Harry, well, before we get into the central bit and talking about IEDs, just give me a little bit of background on your upbringing and your family.
So I'm one of those people who has a very military background. I think until I left the army, there'd been someone serving in the military for over 150 years. So it was very much on the radar for me to join the military. But actually, I have a slightly strange route in because I went to art school and I always wanted to be an artist, and I never did any of those things that you can do at school, like
CCF.
Yeah, or OTC at a university. I never did any of that because it was never really something I thought I was going to end up doing. But lo and behold, whether it was nature or nurture, I joined and went to Sandhurst in 2006.
Yes, I was rather similar actually. When I was the same. I wasn't military at all. I was in the CCF, but I was terrible. But then I ended up at Sandhurst, and it was rather a good way to do it, I think, because I didn't spend the whole of my childhood dreaming about being a soldier. Okay, so family in the military, and your father was a soldier. He's retired now, is he? In the same regiment as you?
He is. He was in the same regiment, and he was at the we were at opposite ends of the hierarchy. He was a general by the time I joined, and actually by the time I left, he left a little bit before me, but he was full general by then. And what was interesting is I was sort of at the very much the lowest tactical level of these operations, Iraq and Afghanistan, and he was in the highest of command positions, and even commanded when General McChrystal was sacked by President Obama and David Petraeus took over. Dad was in charge of the whole of Afghanistan for a couple of weeks, which I think was probably an interesting experience for him, although he'll just say that he was only in charge in sort of name only.
So you went to Sandhurst and you joined the Rifles. How does that work with, just for people who haven't been through the military, with joining, a family regiment? How does that happen?
So it might be a little bit different now, but at Sandhurst, there's quite a sort of extensive regimental selection process. And because Sandhurst is quite a competitive environment, so you're going through a number of different selection processes, and they're really testing out how good you are. And in that process, also all the regiments are sort of sniffing around in a way for the best people for them. And as ever, different regiments need different types of people. If you want to be an engineer, then there's a very different skill set. And so throughout Sandhurst, there was a sort of route, and I very much wanted to join that regiment. And then, I was lucky and got in, and then you go on and you do actually where the real training happens, which was in Brecon, which is called the Platoon Commander's Battle Course, which was a sort of 4-month course, and where Sandhurst is very much a leadership course, although the way they teach it is through infantry tactics. It was only when you get to Brecon that actually that's where the real training in terms of infantry tactics and the sort of seriousness of it, if you like, really sort of happened. And then very quickly I was deployed to Iraq. So I left training, and then 3-4 weeks later I was in Basra.
Right. Was the regiment already out there and you went to join them?
Yes, they were a month ahead of me, or a few weeks ahead of me. So I met my platoon for the first time out in Basra, which was an interesting experience.
And how long did you serve in Iraq?
6 to 7 months.
And what was going on at that time in Basra? 2007
was a very interesting period in southern Iraq. There was all sorts of changes happening in the sort of, I think politically we'd had enough, to put it bluntly, the UK, and we were trying to pull out. And also the situation on the ground in Basra was becoming quite difficult. We were trying to pull out, and the Iranian-backed forces there, Jaish al-Mahdi, or JAM as we called them, were getting more and more sort of brazen in the city. And so we were trying to patrol a city of 2 million people with a battle group, sort of 600 soldiers and the attachments. And I had, so a platoon was 4 fighting vehicles, and we had a thing called the Bulldog, which was always entertaining because I'd get in it, and the first thing I'd noticed that as someone who's 6 foot, it was very tight and small, and I think that was because there was a sign next to me that sort of had the date that it was made. And the vehicle I was in was made in 1962, I think it was, and this vehicle had been in service since then. Of course, it had a new engine, new power pack. It had very clever armor on it and things like that. But essentially, we're sitting in this
the same old bit of kit.
Yeah, and then rumbling around the city and trying to, it was sort of hard to know what we were doing, because that was the moment where we withdrew from the city and we gave the palace, which is where we were based, so Basra Palace, we gave it back to the Iraqis. So I was in that final patrol that sort of left the palace, and we redeployed, as we put it. I'm sure the Jaish al-Mahdi would say that we retreated, but we withdrew.
We withdrew. That was what we were always told to say. You withdraw, you don't retreat.
Yeah. We withdrew to the airbase, which is where most of the British forces were, which was sort of out on the outskirts of Basra, and did some slightly different but very interesting operations out onto the border with Iran. So it was a very interesting time, and actually, although people think of Afghanistan as being more lethal, actually, for me, that time in Iraq was far more challenging, certainly in terms of leadership, in terms of understanding what was going on at all levels of the conflict. And also, it felt very lethal. They were using these shaped charges, which is a slightly different type of IED to what we'll be probably talking about later. But they were designed to defeat armor. So it would fire a plug of molten metal through the side of the vehicle, and essentially, because of the way very, very fast-moving objects work, that could kill people inside very easily, and it was very dangerous. And so, actually, in 4 months, we had I think it was 11 deaths in our battle group, which by any standards was a lot, and lots of casualties as well.
But that was all, it wasn't firefights at any point, it was all IEDs, was it?
No, well, it was a mixture, actually. So often there would be an IED, and then that would be followed up with an ambush or small arms. And we were doing sort of strike operations and things like that. So it was a mixture of everything, really. We had the other thing that sort of characterized that tour was we had a lot of indirect fire, and that's people mortaring the camp. So we'd have sort of up to 70 rounds a day falling on the camp. So that was always an interesting experience lying flat on the ground while mortars fall around you. And I think that's something that's quite unusual these days in the military, to be sort of lying on the floor while those sorts of rounds fall around you, because there's literally nothing you can do but lie there and hope.
And do they? The mortar, there's a thump and then a bang. Is there? There's like two parts to it. So do you get a bit of a heads up that something's coming?
Well, you get that heads up. It slightly depends on the type of round. They used to fire rockets as well, but what we had was essentially a radar. So it was a bit of kit that I'm sure was American, but sat on top of one of the high buildings and would pick up any rounds as they were in flight. So you'd get a siren often before you heard the firing point. And because of the way a mortar works, you'd hear the firing point before you heard the impact point. So we had a number of different ways.
Right, and the siren would give you, what, a second to hit the deck? Or
No, a little bit more than that, maybe 5-10 seconds, sometimes longer. It sort of it very much depended on what was being fired. There was different types of mortars. I'm going to get this all wrong. It feels a long time ago, but there was a 60 millimeter mortar. There's a 90 mil. And what was interesting about it was that it was very clear that these mortars and the munitions and the shaped charges, actually, they're quite complicated bits of kit, although you can make them homemade, but they were being made most likely in Iran. And it was very much a proxy war, which was, which when you think about it now, is quite sort of, it was an interesting place to be when you were 23.
Absolutely. You were thrown in the deep end, straight out of training. Okay, so that was Iraq. And then in 2009, so you came back from Iraq and then you were in the UK for a bit, were you? A year or so, doing training and sorting stuff out?
Absolutely. So there was a sort of rotation. I think our rotation, we had about 18 months of training before we then redeployed to Afghanistan.
And when you come back from Iraq, did you go sort of via Cyprus to decompress and all of that? Was that all part of the thing in those days?
It was, although in my time in the army, that process changed a lot. So partly because of the military was thinking much, in that time we were learning about, or the military was learning about post-traumatic stress disorder and how to manage it. And so in that time, I think when I came back from Iraq, it was a few days in Cyprus. But by the time I left Afghanistan, not that that's the way I came back obviously through a different route, and we can talk about that later. But the soldiers who did come back through the decompression, I think it was much longer. But yeah, I came back from Iraq, and I think 48 hours after being in Iraq, I was in a pub in London, and actually that was quite a weird experience.
Yes, with friends who are civilians who have no concept of anything more than stubbing their toe or falling off their bicycle.
Yes, yeah.
Okay, so then in 2009, you get deployed again with your regiment, the Rifles, to Afghanistan. And that was, what was that called? Ops. They always had those names, Ops something or other.
Yeah, so Iraq was called Op Telic,
yes.
And I was on Telic 10. And then Afghanistan was Herrick, and I was on Herrick 10, which was 2009. And we deployed in May, I think. Yeah, May.
Yes, and that would be a 6-month tour to Helmand.
Absolutely, yeah. And we were sort of west of Lashkargah in an area of Helmand near the Helmand River, which had been irrigated in the 60s or 70s by USAID. So it was essentially an area which probably would have been much more desert than it was when we were there. But there was this grid of a huge grid of irrigation ditches that basically covered, I don't know how far, but a lot of ground.
And they were growing what, cotton or something like that, were they, or what do they grow?
Yeah, God, this is going to. They were growing a variety of different things, from sort of wheat and barley, I think, right, through to poppies. The whole
everything you might need.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, and then so you got out there with your platoon. Do you call it? You do call it a platoon in the Rifles, do you? Because sometimes regiments have different names for things.
It's a platoon, yeah. But actually, I re-rolled because it's quite rare to have a platoon for that long. You do it for a couple of years and then you move on. And so I was actually an influence officer, which was the best way of describing it was sort of somebody who was trained to do the hearts and minds stuff. but it had been sort of, I suppose, been made more scientific than it was in Northern Ireland. And so I had been on a number of courses in that time to learn about how you influence the local population to support us or support the government, the sort of legitimate government of Afghanistan, rather than support the insurgent.
Okay, so this wasn't just in villages. This is higher up when you're talking to politicians and so on. Is that what you were doing?
Well, it works throughout every level, but the idea, my role. So I was a company level intelligence officer. Sorry, I was a company level influence officer, and we had our area of operations, and it was my role to find out who all the, although obviously a lot of this information was passed down, it wasn't a standing start, but find out who the sort of local leaders were, who the who would sort of have the shuras, who the insurgents were, what the sort of tribal dynamics were. I mean, almost impossible to do as a white British person who didn't speak any Urdu or Farsi or Pashto or any of the languages that are spoken. And so that was my role. But actually, most of the influence we did was essentially a conflict zone. You know, most of the influence we were doing was with kinetic weapons. And what I mean by kinetic weapons is shooting.
Yes. Actually, we're going to come on to your book in a minute, but there is one of the chapters is, I think, describes very well the young officer in the novel who is meeting a local leader and gives a very good feel for how much he's on the spot, the leader, you know, the Afghan, because he's not pro the insurgents, but the problem is he has to live there and he has to deal with things, and he's being threatened by these people, that if he has anything to do with you and the soldiers and the Brits, his daughter's going to have her head chopped off. I mean, it's really very, very, a very difficult situation for them to cope with.
No, well, just with the recent, I mean, lots of people have been asking me because we've just withdrawn. You know, the US and everyone has just withdrawn from Afghanistan, and so there's been a lot of people asking me, you know, how I feel about it, and I sort of give a slightly crass answer, which is sort of I don't feel a huge amount, because I don't really connect my service to anything political, any particular war. I mean, I could have been sent anywhere, and we'll get on to my injuries, but I don't really connect them to any. I don't sort of feel angry about them, but also, you know, Iraq's not exactly a success story either. So you sort of have to live with these things. And I think the last thing is, I think I feel as sort of sad as anyone else who's a citizen of this country and has voted the governments in. You know, it's obviously really, it's a horrible situation for the people who live there. The last thing I'd say, just going back to the thing about the local population and the leaders and how they had to sort of balance between the insurgent and the government. I think we have because we have quite a sort of strong sense of what a state is here and what it feels like to be British, or however we identify. Having been there, I was just, you know, some of these people had never even been to Kandahar, and that was 30 miles away. I mean, Kabul could have been on the moon.
Yeah, had no allegiance.
It's a bit of I mean, you've also got to be careful not to sort of paint the whole place with one brush, but there were definitely people there, and there's a slight apocryphal tale of British soldiers wandering into villages and the local population thinking they're Russians because they hadn't sort of realised the Russians had left from the 80s and 90s. But there is a sense that, you know, these people are much more focused on you know, tribal dynamics, their local village. You know, it is in a sense a little bit more of a feudal society, but, you know, add in your G3 mobile phone. So yeah, I think that's all I'd say on it. You know, I think it doesn't necessarily feel like one state or one country, and I think that was one of the reasons it was so difficult to have a sort of meaningful a meaningful impact there.
Yes, and I think people do conflate the story of the soldier on the ground with the strategic history of battles and wars, and they can be very different things. So when you were out there doing the influencer job, did you...
Influence officer was,
influence officer. So what was your general experience with IEDs? I mean, was this an everyday thing that there was stuff coming in, information, it was happening all the time, and it was the main thing, or was it sort of firefights and everything else as well?
I mean, the firefights were daily, but they felt much less lethal. The enemy had worked out that the best way to cause damage and have a tactical impact on us and it was having a strategic impact as well. We can get onto that later, but was to use IEDs. It was a very effective way of constraining us, basically. So there were IEDs placed all over the place. It was like, somebody described it to me when we were there as a nuisance minefield. So they were everywhere. And a lot of our time and effort was spent marking where they are, where we thought they were, and trying to get sort of intelligence about where they were placed. But essentially they were placed on the routes that we used, or the likely routes we used. So any road out of there, and there weren't very many roads. And what you have to remember is we actually spent a lot of our time and effort resupplying ourselves, just being extended. So I'm using quite a lot of military terms, but being extended out there in the when you push out and sort of project a force out into an enemy territory, keeping it sustained is hard work, and you can't do it all with helicopters. So every week we'd have a big convoy, well, not necessarily that big, but trucks. A convoy would come in. Yeah, trucks would have food, the post, water, fuel, weapons, ammunition would all come in. And to do that, the convoy would have to have its own protection of armored vehicles. It would have its own protection force, but it would then be handed through all the places it would be going. So it would go through all the camps, and they were all spread out sort of 10 kilometers apart. But to drive 10 kilometers sometimes would take 30 hours, because every inch of road would have to be swept for IEDs. We would have to move out as a company and secure the road before it came. So you would essentially go and camp out along the road with your platoon and your sections. You'd place them all out over the ground, and then you'd wait for these vehicles to come down. And inevitably, either one had a flat tire, it fell in a ditch, or it got blown up and had to be recovered. Every time you have to recover a vehicle, that takes hours. So often we'd be sat, instead of collapsing back and then re-securing the route, we would just wait. And obviously then you become quite vulnerable to attack.
And you're very, very tired as well by then. You could be out for hours and hours, and you're totally fried.
Yeah, dehydrated, exhausted. But also, interestingly, it was the time when we got to know the local population best, because you have to be there. So people would be working in the fields, and there would be local. You'd often be sort of asking people if you could sit on top of their roof and things like that. I mean, that's slightly unusual, but you're in their land, and that was when I could do a lot of my sort of real job. It was just when you realised that everyone had disappeared from the fields for some strange reason. You knew any minute.
Well, yes, I was going to say something's going to happen.
Yeah.
So did the locals not get blown up that much? It was just you guys, or did they get hurt?
I mean, I don't know if anyone's ever done. If there's any way of ever working it out, but I suspect that the civilian casualties for IEDs are just as. I wouldn't be surprised if somebody said more civilians were hurt and killed through IEDs than soldiers. And often in the middle of the night, we'd hear a bang, and I knew that there were no friendly forces out. So it would either it was just had gone
somebody
off, or a dog, or or exactly. So and I think from Bastion, which was the medical hospital where British and American soldiers went to be sort of patched up, more local civilians went through there than soldiers, and often they were IED casualties.
Right. So would they, if somebody was hurt by a bomb or in crossfire, of small arms fire or something, would they then go to the military hospital and get treated? Was that the policy?
Yeah, if they could get there, and if they came to our camp, we would airlift them in the same way exactly the same way we would airlift a coalition soldier. And they would get exactly the same care for frontline care. Once they were surgically fixed, then they were sort of pushed back into the Afghan medical NHS equivalent, which is obviously not that robust. But yeah, like any conflict, the medical, you treat any person exactly the same.
Okay, and then I don't actually have the date of it, but then you were out on patrol one day. What day? When was that?
The 18th of July, 2009. Yeah,
and just another day in country.
Yeah, another day in country. Although we were trying to do something quite. We had been out as a company trying to sort of ambush the enemy before they used to attack us every morning. So you'd wake up and the compound or our patrol base would be shot at. So we thought, we'll try and get out there early and ambush them. But as ever, when you try and do that, you can't keep yourself. It's very difficult to stay sort of unseen. But even though we went out in the middle of the night, anyway, there was no one there. And lo and behold, that morning, no one attacked us. And then we were collapsing back to our patrol base, and I was leading the way back in, and I stepped on an IED.
And you were leading your patrol, your platoon, were you? A platoon?
Well, no. So I wasn't. Because I was an influence officer. I was sort of it was quite a cool role because I didn't have very many responsibilities to other soldiers. I had a small team that worked with me, but they were all interpreters and specialists. So we were quite free roaming.
So you attached yourself to a group that was doing something?
Yeah, I was just part, and we were working because of the IEDs. There become cleared lanes that everyone walks down, and so there's a lot of single files go on, and everyone walks in each other's footsteps because at the front you normally metal detect to clear the way, and metal detecting was one way that we tried to spot IEDs because often they had metal in them to do with the way they work, the way they're put together with electronics and things, and the whole company group, and it was probably 40 people. We didn't take everyone, but it was a company mission. So the company headquarters was out with us, and as we collapsed back, I ended up being the lead person. And because I'm an officer and you're the leader, that's fine. And I just walked out across a field, and because the field was in sight of the camp, and also I wasn't on a path, I wasn't metal detecting because I was taking a risk essentially. But it was a risk I thought was I wouldn't have done it if I didn't think I didn't think it was if I thought it was too much of a risk. But anyway, I did it. There was a device in the middle of the field that I stepped on.
And do you mind describing what it felt like?
Well, the book's a good place to start for that.
The following is an extract from Harry Parker's book, Anatomy of a Soldier, Chapter 42, The Blast. I existed for a fraction of a moment. I was created by an explosive reaction from a device that functioned to form me. I passed through rock, through mud, through dust, through the air, through the sole of a boot, through a man. I stamped through them all, folding them in shock and pressure and dragging them up with me. I am also noise. Try bang, try boom, try dull thud thump, try kercrump, try piercing ping, puncturing perforated drum. I crushed him against gravity. He couldn't stay whole, and I disintegrated his foot, slamming through it and bursting it open, foot and boot fragmenting in my wake. I forced them up with the dirt I punched up in my supersonic swell, tearing straight through skin. Trashing all that should be sacred. I was all around him and in him and through him, flaying a finger off, flashing flesh from a forearm, blasting a boot buckle deep inside him. I ripped up his leg, flapping his calf off in my wind. I stripped his trousers away and his penis fluttered in my storm. I pulled open his testicle. I dragged bone deep into his thigh, pushing through pink flesh and vessels, bursting open grey globules of fat. I went through him, shocking his nerves and muscles and jarring his spine, crushing him in his armour. I beat through his diaphragm and collapsed his lung and up his back, compressing his skull and banging it into his helmet, and over him with dust and dirt into the sky in a pyre of bubbling, boiling brown. He would have snapped if I had existed for any longer, but he flexed in me and then flipped and clattered to the earth. And then I was spent, and wind dragged in to replace everything I'd blown out, all fleeting and invisible except for what I'd lifted, which now rained down around him, and my bang rolling out across the landscape.
That's where I really write about it. But I think what was, the violence of it, and that sort of the violence that can be contained in high explosives, they sort of get that impression, being flipped over very quickly and sort of feeling like I lands on my head. I suppose the the thing that people often talk about is that feeling of, right, I'll just dust myself off and get up now, in the first few seconds of after it happening, and my whole sort of body vibrating, sort of fizzing with all sorts of feelings. It was if, you know, my nerve endings weren't really working yet, and then quickly realizing that I wouldn't be getting up, and then, you know, then some pretty, I mean, the sort of pain that I can't imagine now. And I think the body's quite good at sort of making sure you can't remember what it was like. But yeah, I was pretty sure I was on the way out, and that was the end. And in a way it was. I mean, I died a number of times and had to be resuscitated. And the helicopter, I was quite lucky. The helicopter was flying to pick up a local civilian, as we've just talked about, but who'd actually been bitten by a camel spider. So there was an American helicopter flying over the camp and almost saw it happen, so that the helicopter could land and they could get me into the helicopter much more quickly than they would have otherwise. And then I was back and in Bastion, which is this incredible trauma hospital in the middle of the desert. I mean, in the next book I've written, I talk about the fact that if I'd been blown up and had the same injuries in central London, I would be less likely to survive than I was where I'd had them, really, in the middle of a desert, because this trauma hospital had all the kit and all the right people, critically, right there and ready to sort of do everything they needed to do. So in 18 minutes, I was on the surgeon's table.
And what were your injuries, Harry?
So when I was blown up, I lost my left leg below the knee to a traumatic amputation. I lost my finger, I lost a testicle, and my right leg was really, really badly sort of blown up on one side of it. And I had some other sort of shrapnel type wounds to my arms. Just fast forward 10 days, once they'd got me back to Birmingham, then I lost my right leg above the knee to infection. So although I had that after the injury, it was so knackered that it had to come off later. And
the first moment you kind of coming to terms with this, what was your greatest fear of injury? What kind of injury was the greatest fear you had, or did you not have that thought as such?
There's no sort of, I mean, I don't think there's any one moment where I sort of woke up and went, shit, I've lost my legs. Because I mean, I sort of woke up over time, if that makes sense, coming out of sort of anesthetic and, you know, lots of pain medication and things like that. So, but I think, you know, I think for me, it all felt quite hopeful quite quickly, because I had a very loving family. I was lucky with my background and my education. I didn't think, oh, my life's over. I just thought, oh, I can go and do something else now. But I think, you know, that loss of what is, you know, when you're a young, fit soldier, that loss of that sort of freedom and that physicality is quite a big hit. You know, that's quite hard to take. And I think that was probably the biggest thing.
Okay, well, I think we should then come on to your novel, The Anatomy of a Soldier, because it describes young Captain Tom Barnes, who is blown up by an IED. But it is a novel. And as I said earlier on, it's sort of, it works through the objects in the book. So it's the objects describing from their particular angle what they see going on with you, whether it's a tourniquet or the bomb itself or the oscillating surgeon's saw, the rug, your dog tags, and actually most difficult to read, the handbag, really, your mother's handbag.
The following is an extract from Harry Parker's book, Anatomy of a Soldier, Chapter 7, The Handbag. I was normally placed on the lime green tablecloth in the kitchen. That day I was next to the dog lead on the coffee-stained newspaper. The doorbell rang. The dog barked. The dark outline of two figures showed through the glass panels. She came in from the sitting room and shut the dog out behind her. She craned her neck to see. She wasn't expecting anyone. It was a man and a woman. He was wearing a regimental tie. They said her name. She nodded. They asked if they could come in. She gripped the door and didn't open it any wider and asked what had happened. She didn't want them to come in. She had imagined the horror of this moment, but she was numb. She was aware of the potential for grief. It curled around her throat and fluttered in her stomach. She remembered her son's smile and the last time he'd walked out of the gate and said that he would be fine, and she remembered wishing he wouldn't tempt fate like that. She remembered when he was 8 and had cried on the way to school. She remembered when he finished training and how proud she'd been. She remembered she'd felt the same dread every time the doorbell had rung since he had been away. She remembered not wanting to go downstairs and the relief when it had been door-to-door salesmen and how much nicer she had been to them. And now she wished she hadn't come downstairs. Maybe she could just take the dog for a walk and they wouldn't be here when she came back. She didn't want to face this on her own. They asked again if they could come in. She let them in, but wanted them to go away and never return, to have never existed. She put the kettle on and told them they would want a cup of tea. It wasn't real until they said it. They told her it was fine and she should really sit down. They sat around the table and the man asked a number of questions, confirming who she was. She just wanted to know now, to just be told so the horror could start. She knew she was about to be damaged. It would change everything. He asked if she was his mother. Of course she was. The woman stood up. She looked grave and hadn't said anything since they had come in. She probably hated doing this. "Let me make you a cup," she said, and went over to the kettle. She took a mug from the cupboard, but when she saw it said "Mummy's Little Soldier" written on it, she put it back and chose another. And then the man told her what had happened. Her son had been very seriously injured and was being operated on. It was the best frontline medical facility in the world. He said they didn't know many details yet, but he was very seriously hurt. He had lost a lot of blood and his left leg. That was all they knew at the moment. She was relieved. He wasn't dead. Her son was still alive. The man continued to talk and asked where her husband was and if she should call him. She reached over and picked me up, pulled my magnetic clasp apart and took her phone from inside me. Her voice shook as she told her husband, not knowing how to form the words. She gave as many details as she could, and then her voice started to break, and she handed the phone over to the man. He explained the same things he had to her, and then put the phone down and told her he was on his way back. She remembered him, 3 years old, running down the beach on holiday, giggling. She wanted to cry, but couldn't, not in front of these people. The woman put a cup of tea in front of her. She looked at it, but didn't see it. Then she asked what very seriously injured meant and whether he would live. They gave answers she knew they were trained to give, and realized that even though she wished they had never come, they hated this too, and she felt sorry for them. Suddenly she knew the relief might be unfounded, that her son might have already died on an operating table. She thought of him dying, perfectly formed and desperately far away without her. And then she remembered the man he said had lost a leg, and she adjusted the image on the operating table, and her imagination went too far and added injury after injury. It deformed him, and he wasn't her son anymore, and it was just too much, and her face began to crumple, and she asked them if they would just give her a moment. She grabbed me from across the table and went out of the room and stumbled upstairs, pulling herself forward with the banister. She put me down on the white-painted chair and bent over the toilet and was sick. She was sick again and concentrated on not making any sound, not wanting them to hear. She crawled over to the door and locked it and leant back against it. She felt inside me for tissues and wiped around her mouth, and then brushed the tears away from her eyes. She wasn't crying. The tears were from being sick, and she wondered why not. She focused on her breathing and waited. There were footsteps below, and the woman whose name she couldn't remember was calling up the stairs. She answered impatiently that she was fine, she just needed a minute. She replaced the pack of tissues and left her delicate hand limp in me. It trembled and her rings glinted. Then she clenched her hand until it hurt and her skin whitened and the fine veins bulged blue. She brushed her teeth but couldn't bring herself to look in the mirror. And then she left me and went downstairs. The murmur of voices came from below and a car crunched over the gravel and the dog barked with excitement. Her husband's deep voice entered the conversation as the talking continued. It was dark when a car left.
So when you thought about writing a book after you come out of hospital, did you spend a long time thinking, how am I going to tackle this subject? Or did this idea come to you, this is how I'm going to do it?
I started painting and drawing because that was my sort of background from fine art. And I just never felt I could really say what I wanted to say. And I'd always written a bit at art school, but nothing much. And then I started to write, and actually I wrote a story from the point of view of animals, and it was pretty crap. And somebody said to me, well, why are you writing it from that point of view? Why don't you just write straight? I did this, I did that. Or, if you want to do a novel, just turn it into fiction. Mm. But there was something about an altered perspective that that felt important for me for lots of reasons, and we could talk about them for a while. But essentially, a lot of it was about having the space to talk about it, to turn it into something new, something creative, to be able to talk about the other side. So that what's important about the book is also that it talks about the insurgents and my perspective of that life and what that meant to me as a soldier. So the objects create this this sort of distancing that I could then turn it, without getting too up myself, into art and something a bit different. And I think one of the reasons was I'd seen some other soldiers who'd written books that were non-fiction, and there was always people who were sort of against that. And I think just from being a soldier, it's quite a sort of private thing sometimes. And no matter what you do, when you tell the story of a conflict, you can't get everyone's point of view. And there's always going to be people who say, oh, well, that didn't happen, or it didn't happen like this or like that. And then there's some sort of political things about the book where it doesn't mention that it's Afghanistan, and of course it is, but there's lots of my experiences from Iraq that are in there. And also I just really enjoyed doing it that way as well. It sort of allowed me to do it.
Yeah, well, it is a very very good book, a very moving book, and very interesting. And this podcast, which is we're discussing the IED in the next couple of episodes, it gives a lot of information. It is sort of exactly what I wanted, how they made a bomb using fertilizer and these very sort of everyday things, which then turn into this sort of terrifying object that can just destroy a life.
Yeah. So one of the objects is a bag of fertilizer, and that sort of travels around a bit. And then another object is the IED being made. And it's not sort of, it's not a recipe. I was quite careful that it wasn't sort of scientific fact that if someone read my book, they'd be able to make a bomb. But it's close enough, I think. And I think it was just interesting for me to think about who the people were who made the bomb. And it's completely imagined, but it's based on my experience being there and the sort of, the knowledge through intelligence and that job that I did. And I suspect it's not too far off the mark. And also just this idea that as you said, these everyday objects can be turned into something that is so lethal. The thing that, for me, the thing that was very interesting coming home was that there were sort of headlines saying the cowardly Taliban, how dare they use these IEDs to defeat us? It's really in some way it's cowardly to use an IED. And as a soldier, that seemed quite strange and in the book, so there's an IED, but there's also a drone, and the drone drops a missile, and it kills some civilians in that moment. And I was very interested in the fact that how a drone, which is at 10,000 feet, and you could be sleep in your bed, how that could just fall on your house and blow you up. And that felt no less cowardly. And I suppose that's because you just use what you have in a war. War isn't cowardly or not. You do what you can with the equipment you have. And of course, people say, "Oh, well, the law of armed conflict. Mines are, you can't use mines and things." But you have to remember the sort of asymmetry of this conflict, if that makes sense. And what I mean by that is the fact that we had all this kit, all these systems and radios and protection, and there was, every time I went on patrol, there was an Apache above me or something else, and they had very little.
And it was ever thus. I mean, we like talking about fighter pilots in the Second World War above the Channel dueling because it's a very clear fight between two men who are soldiers or airmen. But most war is not like that. It's refugees being machine gunned on the side of roads and people starving. And it always seems to come back to, if these things are going to happen, you've got to get it done as fast as possible, short and sharp. So PTSD is talked about a lot. You mentioned it earlier, and I think the first time I'd heard about it in the sort of modern context was our men coming back from the Falklands, and that they'd learned a little bit about it because the men coming back on the boats had a couple of weeks on the boat coming back, and that they could decompress. But then I've since talked to people who said those men some of them had real grave problems 20 years later, or even now they're being they're having to have treatment now. Your book, was it a cathartic displacement for you? Did it help?
No, that's not. I mean, I remember somebody quite soon after I had published it was sort of telling me how it must be therapy for me, and it was at an event actually, a sort of a sort of literary event. So they were in the audience, sort of telling me that this was definitely catharsis and therapy, and I sort of said no, it wasn't. And maybe I was being a bit. They were also implying that I had PTSD, and I haven't got it. And I think there's a slight misunderstanding about what PTSD is and whether soldiers you don't have to have PTSD just because you're a soldier. But the book felt very creative for me. Actually, I really enjoyed writing it. I think there's catharsis writing any book. Anyone who's sat down and written 90,000 words and then printed it out, there's a bit of
it's hard work,
exhaling of breath when you've finally printed out. But I think, for me, anytime you put, for me, the book was about it's a sort of thought experiment in the world. In a way, I was sort of working out where I'd been and what this conflict was and how I related to the other people who were in it. So I don't think it was catharsis in that sense, but looking back, I mean, there's probably a bit of that going on, but it wasn't sort of, and hopefully if people read it, they see that hopefully it's not sort of navel gazing in that sort of sense.
I think it's almost the opposite because it's so objective.
It burned quite brightly in me, the idea, and so I just carried on with it. But it's like anything, there are people who I can just tell that it's not the way it just doesn't work for them. It's this idea of the objects telling the story. It's just going back to the PTSD thing, because I've thought about it a lot recently, particularly with the next book that I've written. And actually, there's what's more likely than PTSD when you go through a trauma is PTG, post-traumatic growth, which is where when something awful happens to you. And a good example is cancer patients. Often when they're diagnosed, there is an element of post-traumatic stress. But as soon as treatment starts, they start to feel growth. And
does that mean like you fighting the fight? It
means that you for whatever reason, as humans, we can turn something, and it's there's sayings across all cultures. There's from great suffering comes hope. And what's the other one that I've always hated? What doesn't kill you makes you stronger.
Oh yes, that's very.
It's the idea that and it's bollocks, that one, but it's one that gets thrown around a bit. But it's this idea that the sort of as humans we can turn suffering into something that's positive, and what's strange is two things can coexist. So you can feel some parts of your life are futile and the world, but also have closer connections, feel more spirituality, and have a more positive outlook on some elements of your life. And I think what happens sometimes is that if you have a bad car crash, you will experience some post-traumatic stress. That's for 3 months or so, you will have nightmares, and you'll ruminate about it, and you might wake up in the night. But what the D is something else. That's a switch in the brain, which means that you're re-experiencing these things for too long, and it becomes a disorder.
Right.
And it's just not the case that all soldiers have that. But I do think
So the brain can needs time to process a thing, and it might do it successfully, but it might get stuck. I mean, I've heard of this. I don't know if you heard. I'm sure you have the EDMR as a way of treating people who are sort of stuck in a loop. Is that sort of considered to be quite a good way of treating people, or?
I'm not. I mean, I'm not. There are lots of ways.
Right.
I'm not a expert on it really. I suppose for me that we could talk. That there are, and it happened a little bit. Maybe we can talk about that too. It happened a little bit with the injured soldiers, but because there are people suffering and there are pressure groups and charities that we need to look after these people. But because of the way they sort of market themselves and raise money, there's a bit of a danger that you paint everyone with the same brush. And we really do need to look after people. And, you look at the sort of suicide statistics and things like that, and they're often painted in a way that make them look worse than they actually are. But it's definitely a reality. And I'm really clear that we need to look after it. But also the danger is that you paint a whole load of ex-servicemen and service people, should I say, who are out there in society being an asset, getting on with their lives, living very happily, with this sort of one brush that we're all a bunch of, we're sort
You're
of
about to crack. We're
all about to crack. And, we've all got to accept that, as you said earlier, I think there's often a 15-year sort of spike sometimes in PTSD cases, and that happened, I think, with Vietnam and the Falklands. So maybe I will need some help, but I just sometimes think it's a bit dangerous to sort of paint everyone with the same, or not paint. I don't mean to put it like that, but to be too
group everyone
about
together.
Yes. Yeah, exactly.
And I mean, a lot has bin talked about. I mean, there's a lot more study and different ways of dealing with it, seemingly, now than there was, in the days of the First World War and shell shock, where they, if you were an officer, you were sent to the loony bin, and if you were a soldier, you were probably told to just get back in the fight. Your new book, before we move on, can we have a little chat about that?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, I'm not giving away any. Have you finished it?
No, not at all. I finished it. Yeah, it publishes in February, and I've just done the final sort of. Well, I've just handed in what I want the acknowledgements to be. So it's quite a nice feeling.
What's it about?
So it's non-fiction this time. I have actually written another fiction book, but it didn't trouble the scorer enough, so it didn't get published, which was a shame. But it's life. But this is non-fiction. It's actually published by the Wellcome Collection. So it's a book about
Wellcome,
how
essentially a medical charity, aren't they? Welcome.
So the Wellcome Trust is a huge medical charity that supports all sorts of medicine and all sorts of things. I think it's the third biggest philanthropic organization in the world, I think. So it's huge. And then they have a museum, and it's on the Euston Road. It's really worth a visit. And their sort of mission is to sort of highlight and explain medical things to people. I think their mission is probably a bit more eloquent than that, but to sort of explore medical issues with people. And the book is about how technology can sort of repair and replace the human body, and what that does to us as humans. And it's written in a sort of series of vignettes. So that's why it's called Dispatches. They're sort of me going off to find out different things, because obviously it's a huge subject.
Yes.
But the idea is that because of my experiences and my dependence on prosthetics that I wear every day, that I have a sort of slight insight into the world and into that world. And so it's a sort of narrative nonfiction.
Right. And is it that we will be able to pretty much rebuild our physical bodies relatively soon? Is that the idea, that, so if people are injured in war, they could actually grow an arm back or something?
So there's, well, no, I think it's a good question. So regenerative medicine and prosthetics are sort of two fields that are still side by side. And I think in 50 years' time, it will still be some mix of the two, and probably prosthetics will still be a big part of it. The problem with any sort of prosthetic is actually how you attach it to the body, the interface. So with a prosthetic limb, for me, it's the rubbing, the itching, the way it has an impact on my musculoskeletal body. It causes me back pain and all those sorts of things. With a deep brain stimulator in the brain, once you put something that's inorganic into the brain, even though it's stopping someone with Parkinson's shake, there is immediately a sort of foreign body response, or often there is, and that can have an impact. So it's a sort of
rejection.
Rejection.
Okay.
I mean, not always, but because we have clever ways of stopping it. But for instance, if you put electrodes into the brain, often the body will wall it off with scar tissue, and that's fine. But what it means is that device becomes less effective because the electrical current that you're putting through it, you have to turn it up essentially. And then that can cause more damage to the tissue because tissue doesn't really like being zapped very much. And so over time, the device gets less effective. And I mean, the costs of medicine are in everything. You know, we're really aware of it. Every time we take a pill, when it starts working on the body, it will reduce the pain or stop some disease, but it'll also often, almost always, have some side effect.
Yeah.
And the thing about regenerative medicine is you get around that because you're creating something that is exactly the same as the body, if that makes sense. So there's very little rejection or cost. But I think, and that's maybe 200 years away. And we can do it in certain things. We can regenerate certain organs, certain types of tissue, cartilage and things. But as soon as you're talking about anything that's more complex than, you know, an esophagus or something, it becomes very difficult to do.
Yes.
And that's all that stem cell stuff.
Right. And so your book will be published into the general market, or is it to be sort of sold within the Wellcome Trust's world and promoted there?
No, this is very much for the world. So hopefully you'll see it on bookshelves. It's a funny time in publishing. There's no paper around and things like that because of the like with everything.
It's
supply
at sea
chain
somewhere with everything else.
Yeah, there's all that stuff. No, but this is very much, you know, it's on Amazon and it's very much, you know, hopefully it'll make the bookshelves if I'm lucky.
Okay, we're nearly there. IEDs, the sort of lessons. One of the things that I remember from my time in the army, and I had a much easier time than you did because it was the 80s, was the humour. Does that... can you tell me anything about the, you know, in Afghanistan or Iraq, some of the, you know, the ways that men cope with the pressures of being mortared or the threat of being blown up by an IED?
Well, I mean, I can't think of anything specific, but there was definitely that. There was definitely the humour that ran through a lot of military units and kept us going. I mean, when I think about it, it was pretty tough going. We'd have, so any patrol would have 4 what we called a bomber team. So bomber was the sort of code word for what we did, the sweeping of the ground with a metal detector, and they would essentially walk in front of the vehicle, sweeping the ground and listening for a spike in the noise that would say there was something metal. Then they would put up their hand to pause everyone. Everyone would lie down on the floor and they would start digging around with their hands or a little shovel to see if there was a device in there. And when you put it like that, it's pretty bonkers. You know, you're asking soldiers to lie on their fronts and use their fingers to sort of pull away at the ground. And then when they had found that it was just an old shell case or just, you know, an old coin or something,
yeah,
exactly, then you would carry on. And then, of course, you know, the enemy had made low metal content devices, which were very hard to detect. So, but just going back to your question about humor and things, I think, you know, that was degrading on people. It was quite, you know, doing that for 20 hours and that sort of pressure, it was hard. It was a hard sort of, you know, there were some very brave people, I think is what I'm saying. But in general, the sort of what you'd expect, the humor and the banter existed very much throughout all of my service. I think sometimes where, you know, we don't really talk about it much, but where, if, especially in Iraq actually, but also in Afghanistan, when a soldier says to you, you know, especially when somebody's been killed in your platoon, and they say, "Why are we here?" And you have to sort of then trot off the party line about the fact that you're in Afghanistan because we're reducing the threat to the streets in London, it's quite hard to sell that, especially when everyone at home is sort of saying, well, why the hell are we in these conflicts when they have no impact or existential threat to the UK? And I think when you're sort of sent on an operation where there's less of a connection between your sort of homeland and what you're doing, I think there is more of a stress potentially on things like that banter and combat,
yes,
the sort of
FUBAR.
Combat force. Yeah, a little bit. And Vietnam's probably quite a good, a good case study for that, where of course there was all the humor, but actually it was pretty tough on them because it was so difficult to sort of reconcile why you were there.
Yeah. Well, one of the most difficult books to read by the time you get to the end is Catch-22. It's so funny, and it gets so sad as you get to the end. By then you're completely pulled into it, and it's horrendous. And it's so, humour is sort of the other side of howling and crying and everything.
Yeah, no, well, I think, where I suppose where I remember the humour more was, so if you imagine having been flown back and lost both legs, lying in a ward of 6 soldiers, and there being, 2 working legs and 5, I can't do the maths, but 5 working arms or whatever, somebody with their hands sewn into their stomachs so that they could regenerate or they could grow new skin over the top of the hand. Another person whose eyesight had gone, and then another person who, the banter in there, we'd sort of, who would you swap my injuries for your injuries? And we'd all be saying, oh no, I wouldn't have yours. And then yours, I would definitely. And then there'd be somebody who'd gone deaf, somebody who couldn't see, and then somebody who couldn't speak. And so between the 3 of us, no one could. We were just shouting or telling each other to shut up, or trying to read for each other. And then every time they came in and sort of debrided our wounds, which meant they sort of basically scraped away at the scabs. It was bloody painful, and we'd sort of shout, "Oh, you've been shot by a sniper again," and things like that. So that sort of banter definitely still existed and was part of that. I think that was something that carried through into rehab, and I suspect you wouldn't have had that connection and humor had it been a bunch of people who'd been people who hadn't been through the same experience.
Yeah. And sort of post recovery of hospital time anyway, when you're sort of getting back into your life, this was sort of a question really that Jamie was talking to me about, because he has experienced some of this himself because he's blind. Is the sort of the contrasting thing of the threats you feel from people, the sort of stupid encounters, as he called it, and the kindness of others, and just how we treat people who have injuries today, whether they're disabled from birth or whether they've had accidents or whether they've been in the forces. Do you have anything you can? Well,
I think I think Jamie's got such a great sort of outlook on life, I think there is there's definitely, I think if you're disabled, you do see the sort of human kindness and you do feel supported in a lot of ways. But I still think there's so many people who just don't know how to talk about disability at all, and I think sometimes that can be interesting to watch and can come across as feeling, it can make you feel a bit strange, or sort of, and it's 90% of the time or 99% of the time it's not people being cruel, or certainly not in my experience. But I do think that having a disability does definitely change your outlook on life and the way that you interact with people around you in society. And I think the greatest thing that the sort of the greatest punishment, if you like, for my injury is actually how it makes me more anxious about being free. If I was going on holiday, or even, just in everything, you're always slightly anxious about, getting lost, or your leg breaking, or some getting an infection, or having to go back into hospital, or all those things. That is, you have to work quite hard. That's quite a sort of big cognitive load, if you like, throughout your life.
And if you were to, if you were to tell somebody who hasn't got an injury, a sort of one thing that's a good way to react to people, or is that just too dumb? I mean, as an example, when I was a volunteer at the Olympics, and I saw there's a picture of you out there at the 2012 Olympics carrying the flame. I think that's you, isn't it? That is you. Yeah. And I was just one of those guys wearing this sort of nylon tracksuit in at the rowing lake. But they trained us a bit, and one of the things they said when you're dealing with somebody pushing a wheelchair is to talk to the person in the wheelchair, not to the person pushing it. And it's so obvious, but in a way, people do that. They talk to the people on the same height as them, and they consider the person in the wheelchair sort of to be, not capable of having conversation. So what's your... Because I noticed that you wear shorts all the time, for instance, so that indicates to people that you've not got your legs. I mean...
Yeah. It's a sort of, well, it's partly a practical thing. So because it's both practical because they're not that comfortable, so I can take them off much more easily. But it's probably more about communication. It shows people why you need a bit more time and space, and why you might be limping a bit, and why you can't go up the stairs as quick. But in terms of it's just about being human, really, and meeting everyone at a level playing field, I think. And I've written about it a bit, and I've talked to Jamie about it a lot. I'm both, people will ask you if you need help when you don't need help at all. You're just getting on with your own business. And it's sometimes quite difficult not to tell them to,
F off.
Sod off.
Yeah.
But at the same time, sometimes you really do need help, and when people don't bother giving you that help, that's that's also difficult. So I think it's difficult, but I think just being human, and exactly that example is so good. Just treating people as humans and you're talking to them, even though they're in a wheelchair, it's so crucial. And but you see it in all parts of life, even just in people who don't introduce someone who's with them, even though they're...
It's so obvious that uncomfortable dynamic. Yeah. But I mean, and some of it is done out of not malice at all. I mean, because I've spent a lot of time now with Jamie, and I've got, I don't even sort of consider his thing. I mean, I noticed a thing today, because my daughter's dog, barks at people. And I'm trying to work out why he's never barked at Jamie. I would have thought he'd have been the person he'd have barked at most. And because he's a lurcher and he's very much an eye dog, he starts barking at when they look at him and challenge him through their eyes. And of course, look, Jamie's waving his stick around and patting him or patting Maggie, or but the one thing he's not doing is staring at him in the eye. And I've noticed when I see other blind people around, I've got a better sense of when I should help them, what you were saying about when you don't and do need help. So if I see them hovering near a road, I will go up and say, not loudly in their ear, so they jump up, but I'll say, would you like a hand across the road? But when they're obviously doing something they're used to doing, I'll just leave them alone. And it's just through having a little bit of experience with somebody. Yeah,
good experience and common sense. I mean, Jamie, I've talked this about Jamie, because Jamie says things like, he'll give a best man speech or write a letter in the paper.
I wouldn't like him to be my best man. Oh my goodness, that would be terrible.
But everyone sort of
be like
says,
a roast.
But he what he says is people sort of are more they sort of congratulate you more because they feel that your disability is sort of makes you more challenged in every way. And I think the other flip side of that, and I think that's part of what you've just described, is that when you are, if you're with people for when they're your friends or you're with them a long time, you start the disability falls away. You start not to notice the disability. And I think that's really interesting that, if I work with people for a long time, they start not to see the disability.
You're no longer defined by that. That's just something.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I think that's, if you could bottle that and give it to everyone so that they weren't defining anyone by their disability, that would help in a sense, because people they wouldn't be afraid to approach them or ask them if they need help. They would just be sort of completely human towards them.
Yeah. Well, I think we're pretty much there. I just wanted to say, is there anything, back to the IED, anything that you could add or that we should do about IEDs or we should understand about IEDs, or is that a ridiculous idea. It's just that they're a fact of life in conflict zones.
No, I think the only thing I'd say is that they are, that there was a sort of arms race of IEDs as well. So they were always trying to defeat the capabilities and our techniques, because actually the main way that we got around these IEDs was a little bit through technology, but a lot through our techniques, our procedures, to make sure that we didn't stumble into them or we found them. And there was one from Northern Ireland, which I'm sure you know, is the 5 and 20s checks, where you check 5 meters around you to see if there's anything that looks out of place. It might be, the ground's been dug up, or there's some sort of metal substance that looks odd.
I don't remember that one. What was the 20 bit?
So you do 5 meters right around you.
Yeah.
And then you do 20 meters to check further.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then it became the 5. While I was in the army, I think it became the 520 and 200. So you then check for sort of firing points. So you're not always looking too much in the vicinity, and you're looking out. And that's what I mean. So in my time in the army, it sort of developed because, we had to develop what was going on. And actually, when I was blown up, there would have been we need to reassess, after Harry's been an idiot and got himself blown up, we need to reassess whether what he did was right or wrong. And actually sort of the enemy was always making very ingenious different IEDs, ones that were hanging at eye level or were on the sides of irrigation ditches. And in that sense, it's a pretty gritty business, these different, that you're trying to stay one step ahead of something that is essentially trying to maim and damage you and cause as much destruction as possible.
In our next podcast, we're going to be talking to a surgeon, so we will learn from their point of view, how they deal with young men and women who come in with terrible injuries like you have. So, Harry, thank you for that. As I suspected, the meagre acronym IED gives no true indication of the devastating effect that such a device can have on a person's life and the lives of those they love. I have no doubt that what you have told me today helps to redress that in some measure. I'm very grateful to you for you sharing your story with us, a story of courage, fortitude, and hope. Thank you, Harry. I salute you.
Thanks for having me on. It's been great. Thank you.
So it goes. Next week we will publish part 2 of this 3-part series on the IED, the Improvised Explosive Device. I interviewed Dr. Tom Carroll, a vascular specialist who completed 2 tours in Afghanistan as a combat surgeon. Please pass this podcast on to a friend. You can contact me at talk@BloodyViolentHistory.com. Thank you, and good luck.